Hello everyone, welcome to chapter 11 of Give Me Liberty. This chapter is called The Peculiar Institution, and this is going to cover slavery in depth, more in the 19th century than we've been looking at. We've been talking about this the entire semester, so this chapter is entirely dedicated to understanding the political excuses behind the continuation of this practice and the experience itself for people. So we'll dig right in, get moving through this. This is going to be a relatively difficult chapter, I'm sure, for many people to get through. And it's important that we still manage to look at the history that does not leave our country in a particularly positive light, so that we can have a greater understanding of both the good and the bad and have a more balanced opinion about our own history and how it affects the way that we interact with each other even today. So start out talking about the Southern economy, which of course was the most vulnerable aspect if there was this emancipation, if there was this freedom for enslaved people. The Southern economy was largely based on cotton after the decline in tobacco, which we talked about last week. And with cotton expanding into the West, we talked about how enslaved people were being moved to the West. This is called the Second Middle Passage. We talked about the first Middle Passage as being from Western Africa over to the Americas, but this is from Eastern United States to the West, either to the new territories or the new states. And we'll call this the Second Middle Passage. This is an extremely large movement of people from one space to another, but it's intercontinental at this point. Intracontinental. So careful to pronounce that. So that means it's within North America and actually even within the United States. Part of what goes along with this is that the South was less interested in increasing their technological abilities. You saw in the North this expansion of manufacturing and this increased reliance on technology, but the South was still sticking with a more agrarian lifestyle. The cities throughout the South, where they did exist, were mostly used as a gathering spot, as a trading hub. So cotton was, of course, the most popular thing coming through there, but also grains and sugar were oftentimes put through these trade ports. And New Orleans was a particularly important trade port for cotton and sugar, which were both slave-produced goods. So you have this economy that centers in some southern cities and expands out into the hinterlands or moves these items northwards, and it's all depending on slave labor. 3/4 of white Southerners did not own slaves and used family labor instead. So it's about 1/4 of people who were slave owners at this point, white Southerners who were slave owners. Many families who were not participating in enslaving others were relying on subsistence farming to provide for themselves and their families rather than being able to make enough product to sell it to others. The treatment of enslaved people became a concern at this point because with the ending of the Atlantic slave trade in 1808, they became irreplaceable, so that you could expand westward and move already extant people westward, or you could rely on your enslaved population to reproduce and give you more enslaved people that way. But there was no more purchasing people from Africa at this point. in a legal way, anyway. What this all supported was this high society, this planter society. Planters had the most number of enslaved people under their thumb. It was relatively few families who had more than 4 or 5 enslaved people. You had to be extremely rich to be able to buy more than 4 or 5 people. You had to have a lot of money to begin with to even bring on 4 or 5 enslaved people. The planter culture is what people aspired to in the South. It was this ideal, the way things should be. So it's popularly represented, if you've ever seen Gone with the Wind, prior to the Civil War. That sort of lifestyle is what people were envying if they couldn't have it, or attempting to continue if they were within that. Paternalism was a particularly popular mode of interacting with people. So men who were in charge of these plantations throughout the planter society showed paternalism towards enslaved people, women, and children, with the idea that the male would be the leader of the homestead and would guide and protect the others. Protection meant a different thing based on if you were a woman, a child, or obviously an enslaved person. When we say woman, in this case, we mean free white woman. And with this, there's this sort of idea that the male in charge of the plantation is somehow taking care of everybody on the plantation, even if they're enslaved. There was a strict code of honor that Southerners within this societal level were dedicated to following. They would defend their family name. They would attempt not to smear their family name by doing something in public that couldn't be undone. That sort of thing. Extremely concerned with reputation. The cult of domesticity was wildly popular throughout the South, not only in the planter society, but throughout this hierarchical experience that people were going through. So all the different socioeconomic strata had this cult of domesticity that they were interested in, where women would stay home and take care of children and take care of the home and take care of the husband when they came home. So more women were going to work at this point out of necessity, oftentimes in the North, but in the South, people were still really dedicated to these traditional English gender roles. Obviously, attempting to uphold this society, this slave society that had been built throughout the South, there was a pro-slavery argument being discussed. What happened oftentimes was that there was a concern that people found the South to be void of intellectual activity. That people were concerned that if they were able to experience more intellectual pursuits, that they would eventually come around to the idea of emancipation as being morally correct. What had happened over the years was that this original idea that it was something of a necessary evil. Many of the founding fathers discussed this as a necessary evil in order to build up this great country. It was simply translated into the idea that, not simply, I suppose, everything's quite complicated, especially this, but it was translated into this basic idea that freedom and equality were universal, but not when it came to particular people. So when it came to specifically white men, usually in the South, freedom and equality should be universal. At any other level, except for white male, these principles did not apply. Obviously, that signals the fact that white supremacy was spreading throughout the South. There were some pseudoscientific ideas that began popping up, talking about the different races and how whites were at the top of this hierarchy. One of the arguments was that the use of enslaved people was essential to human progress, and no white progress would have happened without the hard work of black workers. So there wouldn't be this great nation that they were attempting to build had they not had access to enslaved people. Another argument that they put forth was that there should be some level of equality for whites, regardless of their socioeconomic status, so that they didn't have to perform the worst jobs. The worst jobs should be performed by the enslaved people, and they needed them in order to fill these jobs. There was also, as we've talked about a few times throughout the semester, this purported biblical legitimacy, with quotations from the Bible being used to support the idea that black people specifically were sentenced to this punishment of enslavement. You'll read in one of the Voices of Freedom documents for this week, it's focusing on slavery and the Bible. And it's this argument that it was indeed sanctioned, and the United States at this time was still very much a Protestant nation. On the other side of things that we probably have most often learned about in our classrooms is the abolition argument. So this is the emancipation of enslaved people. This argument had been going for quite some time and would come to fruition during the Civil War. Latin American and European emancipation were well known at this point. Britain in 1833, and in the Latin American countries following their own uprisings that we talked about a couple of classes back. Some countries even paid out the slave owners so that they wouldn't take a financial hit. So that was an option to give a financial reimbursement, essentially, for taking away a worker. By 1850, only Cuba, Puerto Rico, Brazil, and the United States were left using forced labor en masse. And there were about 4 million enslaved people within the United States by 1860. 1860 being a popular date because it's the beginning of the Civil War. And also census data is available. There was also an emotional argument that was put forward for this abolition argument, this emancipation argument, that people should try to keep families together. So moving people through the Second Middle Passage from the eastern United States to the western United States and splitting up families forever was anti-Christian, anti-moral, or amoral, and they were attempting to say that you didn't necessarily even need to separate people in order to force their labor, but that the enslavement of people should stop regardless. There was also an economic argument that people would work better and not revolt if they were paid. So people would be more dedicated to an employer who is paying them a wage, and if they had their own freedom rather than if they were being forced to do work. Frederick Douglass is one of the most famous voices for abolition, also a former slave. And he was born into slavery in Maryland in 1818 to a white father and a black mother, so he was a mixed race person. The Black mother being the reason for continued enslavement, because we talked about matrilineal slavery. It follows the status of the mother. Obviously not her fault, but that is why he was considered an enslaved person when he was born. He managed to become literate through a number of channels, including the wife of his owner. So she took the time to teach him how to read and write. At one point, he describes being sent to what was called a slave breaker in order to beat him into submission so that he would get these ideas out of his head that he was somehow fully human and could experience everything in life that a white person could. In 1838, he was 20 years old and he escaped to the North. He wrote an extremely famous autobiography that I suggest everybody read, and he went on the lecture circuits throughout the country. He published pamphlets for people to read, and he was known as a feminist as well. So he wasn't just fighting for the rights of Black men. He was fighting for the rights of Black women and women as a whole. He saw these wild inequalities throughout the nation and thought that the nation could only be better if these were fixed. Of course, he was mostly focused on rights for Black Americans, having experienced enslavement himself and then freedom. He died in 1895 and left a lasting impression not only on the people of the time, but also on the historical record. You'll also read in Voices of Freedom part of his narrative of a slave life, and particularly the piece that you'll read is on the desire for freedom. So he'll discuss what that was like for him personally. And it's always best to get firsthand accounts from people and try to balance that with the rest of the information that you're getting so that you can hear what people are saying about their own experience, and then also read about what a more generalized experience would be, so you can see how their experience fits in with the more generalized experience that's sort of an average of all these experiences put together by historians. Enslaved people were legally property belonging to the people or estates which had purchased them, or the farm or estate on which they were born. So there was a legal setting here that bound people to a particular family or to a particular piece of land. At this point, it was technically illegal to kill enslaved people except for in self-defense. This didn't prevent some people from killing them and saying it was self-defense and that nobody's going to go against a white man's word at that point in a court of law. Killing them was against your own financial interests, though, because as we talked about, the Atlantic slave trade was over, so there were no more African enslaved people being imported into the nation. It remained illegal to promote literacy among slaves, so that's why Frederick Douglass is somewhat unique. We've talked about a few others throughout the semester who had owners who were willing to teach them how to read and write as well. In 1855, we have the court case of Celia. The short story of this is that she killed her owner while resisting sexual assault in Missouri, but was not deemed a woman in the eyes of the law. Not being his wife, she was not under his control for sexual encounters, and enslaved women were not covered by anti-rape laws. So she was not considered a woman, she wasn't considered fully human, and she wasn't covered by anti-rape laws even if she had been somehow, in the court of law, considered a full person. She was actually executed for having killed him following the stillborn birth of her child. This is just one of many horror stories that made its way into the courtroom, and went against all what most people today, say 99% of people today would say that this is outrageous and abhorrent. At this point, though, the court was not wildly off base for what they were experiencing in other areas. There were, as there had been the whole time, some free Black Americans. There were about 500,000 free Black Americans in the antebellum period, which means prior to the Civil War. Antebellum meaning before warfare, and usually referring to the U.S. Civil War when we're talking about U.S. history. Even if they were free Americans, they still could not vote or own property, so their citizenship was not quite on par with the rest of the citizens in the United States. They were also forbidden to own dogs, firearms, have liquor, obtain court representation. They were forbidden from serving on a jury, and they must at all times carry paperwork showing that they were a free person, because as we talked about before, there was a large number of runaway enslaved people, and if they didn't have this paperwork showing that they were free, it would be assumed that they had run away and that they were not actually a free person, and they would be taken into custody. The options for a free Black person at this point was either go into enslavement or depart. Depart means leaving the area that they were enslaved in before. Most free Black Americans lived in cities or worked on small farms for wages. So wage earning jobs were still particularly hard to come by for African Americans at this point. Many people didn't want to hire them, or they didn't want to pay them an appropriate wage. There were laws against where they could even work, even if someone was willing to hire them. The labor for enslaved people varied at this point, and they were not only field hands picking cotton, as we've talked about before, and domestics, meaning working within the home, but they also worked in iron and coal mines, on the seaports, and throughout the railroad. So building the railroad, moving west, many enslaved people were used in order to achieve this. The government used slave labor for building infrastructure projects, and they were heavily investing in them at the time as technology for transportation increased. We talked about that in the chapter where these inventions started coming about. So you have the railroad, and you have canals, and you have more roads being built, and many of these were built using slave labor. There were a couple different ways that this would be organized. Gang labor is one way in the field, such as cotton or sugar plantations, where you see a bunch of people working together, sometimes actually chained together. And you also have the task labor system. And this was set up so that if you finished your work for the day and you had time left over, you could work on your own projects or your own farming patches. So long as you got the thing done that you were assigned to do. Enslaved people in urban areas often lived alone, not alone, I apologize, but were sometimes sold into slavery in the South because their owners were suspicious that they would feel that they were too far up in society, living on their own and having a particular job which was probably more posh than working in the fields, which would perhaps lead them to be more interested in their own independence. You'll read about that in Frederick Douglass's writing. So they weren't wrong necessarily that it would increase their drive for independence. They were, of course, wrong for enslaving people. The culture of enslaved people, it's very complicated, but some of the basic things that we can talk about for at least this level of history class is that the family and the church were the cornerstone for enslaved people. This is where they were able to get together. Sometimes they didn't even have supervision when they were within these realms. There was this mix of different cultures that went into both the family and the church and group activities. There was African music, dance, dress, and religion, as well as medicine mixed in with American values and experiences. So you have this unique culture that's the blending of African and American. And with that, you have a number of differences between the enslaved culture and the free white culture. Gender norms looked a little bit different than the European Americans because both men and women were expected to provide labor within the enslaved culture. So women were picking cotton in the fields, doing the same work as men. And this didn't necessarily leave room for the interpretation that women were delicate and needed to stay home. Of course, that's what many people aspired to because that was the popular model at the time, and it would have been the epitome of having freedom to be able to do that. But the gender norms were more complicated, at least. There were separate churches with African traditions blended with Christianity. So you can see on the left here, there's a black preacher, and there was this blending between Christianity and African thoughts, beliefs, words. So you have, again, this unique religion that pops up. Communication networks with more privileged enslaved people who had the ability to move around would spread news as well as local points of interest. So they would spread national and international news. If they had the ability to overhear things, or if they were more privileged within the realm of enslavement and actually had been taught to read or write, they could then bring what they had read to more people who didn't have the same opportunities. One punishment that was used for people who were enslaved was that families would be broken up. So there was this conundrum that they had. If they rebelled against anything, they could potentially be punished by never seeing their family members again. If they didn't rebel, they may never reach their freedom. It's a lose-lose situation, essentially. You've probably heard about spirituals, slave songs, as a form of protest and cultural development. There's a short documentary from PBS on the assignments page for you to watch, just briefly discussing slave spirituals. So please take a look at that. I'm sure you've heard about this before, and I'm sure most of you have watched popular films such as 12 Years a Slave or something in that realm, in which they used a spiritual as part of the soundtrack, but also as a cultural representation of enslaved people's culture. There continued to be levels of resistance, even with the threat that you would be separated from your friends or family. Individual acts and organized uprisings actually became more common, but were still relatively rare because of the lack of supplies in order to resist. So if you don't have access to weapons, you're not going to be able to withstand those who do. Day-to-day resistance was still popular, like breaking tools or sabotaging your work, disrupting routines, saying you were sick, or stealing food. Those were more common than violence against owners or supervisors, and they were more likely to benefit the enslaved person without any extreme rebuttal. Running away was still a common form of resistance, but it was a troublesome route for many because there was a lack of knowledge about geography, and whites were on the lookout for Black people at that point and asking them for their papers to prove that they were free. And if they weren't paired with someone who was white, they were definitely going to be asked for that paperwork. And if they couldn't show it, they would be under suspicion at that point. Most who did run away were young men because women were often less willing to leave small children behind, and small children couldn't make the trip. So young men were usually the strongest and had the least attachment or the least responsibility to others, and were able to go and secure their own freedom. Part of this is this famous network of the Underground Railroad. Abolitionists and runaways helped to lodge and transport people safely into the North. So this was runaway enslaved people as well as free abolitionists, both Black and white. Harriet Tubman is perhaps the most famous conductor of the Underground Railroad. She was born in 1820 and escaped in 1849 to Philadelphia. She escaped into freedom but continued to go south into Maryland to help bring people to freedom. She's credited with saving at least 75 people personally. There's a short biography of Harriet Tubman, and she also wrote her own autobiography, which is quite well known. I'd say at least as well known as Frederick Douglass's autobiography. So please watch that video on the assignments page. You also have stories of people escaping to freedom, like Henry Box Brown. This one, I think, has survived throughout the narrative because it's a particularly ingenious way to essentially send yourself into freedom. He packed and mailed himself in a box from Virginia to Pennsylvania after his wife and children were sold to a plantation in North Carolina. So his family was separated, and he needed to secure his freedom. The box was about 3 feet by 3 feet by 2 feet. And the journey took 27 hours. And he was eventually arrested for attempting to help free more enslaved people in the same manner. So it had worked for him. He'd reached safety. He'd reached people who were willing to help him. And he decided that he would help people attempt to do the same thing. Eventually, he was invited to give lectures around the country for the abolitionist movement to help spread the word about freedom versus slavery and also about creative ways to escape. Obviously, his was quite creative. And you'll hear some more stories about this gaining of freedom through the Underground Railroad. There's a video covering the stories of the Underground Railroad. It's about an hour long, but it's quite interesting, quite informative. It's made about Kansas and made by the University of Kansas or Kansas State College. And please watch that, and you can pair that with the Voices of Freedom documents that you're going to be reading as well for the week. There's also an Underground Railroad museum. There's more than one, I'm quite sure, but there's at least one in Pennsylvania near Philadelphia that you can go into, and it has different artifacts from people who came through and the different stories that of people who made it to freedom. This is a map showing some of the routes for enslaved people seeking freedom. So you can see the jumping off points are in this colorful area, which is the South, slave states, and pretty much all of them pointing northwards. There were some people who escaped to Mexico. There were some people who escaped beyond the United States to the south, but mostly it was to the northern United States, and Canada was seen as sort of the gold standard. There continued to be larger revolts as well. We talked about Gabriel's uprising in 1800 before, but we'll go over it a little bit again. This was the failed attempt to march on Richmond in order to demand freedom. The rain had stopped the group from completing the mission, and the leaders, as well as some of the participants, were killed immediately or executed at a later date. So we talked about that being one of the more famous uprisings in 1800. And in 1811, there was a New Orleans uprising, sugar plantation uprising, with about 500 men and women armed with knives and axes marching into New Orleans. They, as often happened, were met by militiamen who killed at least 66 of them, and the leaders were executed. So it was big stakes if people were going to participate in these revolts. They may not survive the actual revolt, and if they did, they may very well be executed for having participated. In 1822, in Charleston, South Carolina, this was less overt than the first two. It wasn't a group of people marching into a particular city or attempting to march into a particular city, but it was led by Denmark Vesey with the idea that Black people should not submit to whites because they were not inherently equal, as the law said. So they shouldn't step off the sidewalks or onto the streets if white people were walking by. He was a free person after purchasing his freedom, but still cared very deeply for the cause of abolition and emancipation. Eventually, he, as well as 35 enslaved people and free Black Americans, were executed for this conspiracy to say that they were equals to whites, and not to follow the racist laws that were put into effect within their states. They were looking at the Haitian Revolution as a source of inspiration. So with Haiti being an independent nation for Black people, they thought that they could also achieve freedom and equality or be able to carve out their own space. In 1831, you have Nat Turner's Rebellion. This is probably the most well-studied and talked about rebellion. This particular story has a lot of people who come down on both sides of the morality coin. Essentially, Nat Turner stated that God had chosen him to lead a rebellion of enslaved people, and he decided to lead a group of enslaved people from farm to farm in Virginia, killing about 60 white people, and it was mostly women and children. And the rebellion was eventually tamped down by the militia, and 18 of them were sentenced to death. There's a much longer story about this. You could easily find a documentary to watch about this, and there are loads of books written about this, so I wasn't going to beat it to death here. But what this did do was led people to panic and execute innocent people, and with this fear that they were going to revolt against them. And what also happened in conjunction with that is people begin to discuss slavery coming to an end. What it did do in real life, however, was create stricter laws in Virginia for enslaved people, the difference between free and enslaved people, as well as stricter laws for free Black Americans. In 1839, the Amistad, which has a popular movie that was made about it in the 1990s. If you're interested, it was not the worst historical drama that came to film. I think it won a few Oscars. But the story here for the Amistad is that there were 53 enslaved people taken from East Africa and brought to Cuba, where slave labor was still legal. They rebelled against the Spanish who were in charge of the ship, because remember, this is after 1808, so they weren't coming to the United States on a ship. But the Spanish were still moving enslaved people to their own outposts, essentially. And they rebelled against their Spanish captors and eventually landed in the United States, in U.S. waters, in New York, and were eventually taken to Connecticut, where they were jailed until the end of their trial. So they were put on trial for having killed and rebelled against their captors. This ended in the U.S. Supreme Court noting that the Africans would be freed because they were not Spanish citizens and they did not intentionally send themselves to the United States to become enslaved people. And the Atlantic slave trade was outlawed by the United States at this point, so they couldn't necessarily accept more enslaved people fresh from Africa. This is huge because this is a Supreme Court ruling going in favor of African people. So this is seen as a relative victory, especially in the face of a number of failed rebellions. This one worked. There's a documentary here for you to watch on the assignments page that's about murals that were painted depicting the Amistad Rebellion. So please watch that. And when we're thinking about all of this, we have a lot of questions that we need to ask about the representation of this information. So how do we present this information in a historical context? Who is allowed to present this information? So is it only academics who are allowed to present this information? Is it only particular academics? Do you need to be of a certain race? Do you need to be of a certain gender? Do you need to be a certain age? Who should be talking about this, essentially? What formats are acceptable? Is film acceptable? Popular film? Are novels acceptable? Is it only nonfiction that's acceptable? What about artwork? How do we categorize that as fiction or nonfiction? These are questions without any particular answer, really. They're things that you'd need to think about when you're considering what seems okay and what pays due diligence to the people who are involved within these events. Is it okay to make up stories about this and other tragedies in order to present an emotional understanding and create empathy? Or should we only tell accurate stories? Aren't these stories challenging and emotional enough on their own, or can we better represent it in a non-documentary form that allows more people access to an empathetic response. Again, this is something that if you should be thinking about this when you're thinking about any historical representation of something, whether it's fiction or nonfiction. Important questions to ask yourself. And are there some subjects that we need to, treat with more care? Is slavery one of those? Is there particular language that we need to be using when we're talking about these cases? And how do you see this as connected to current day United States? You should be thinking about what the implications of this are and what follows based on these laws and these experiences, and how that rolls into today, how that rolls into how we all interact with each other throughout the United States today. So for this week, you're in your Voices of Freedom book, you're going to be reading Frederick Douglass on the Desire for Freedom, Slavery in the Bible, and Letter by a Fugitive Slave. These are different pieces that will pair up with the videos that you're also going to watch, and you can think about all of these questions while you're going over these materials. I'll also post a discussion question that you can all respond to, and it will be more like one of these questions that doesn't necessarily have a right or wrong answer. You just need to support your view and explain it. So that is all for this week. Next week, we're going to be talking about the age of reform. So we're going to be talking about these movements of people who are attempting to better society. So we'll move on to that for next week. And your papers, as a reminder, are due on Friday. So be sure to get those in. And we will, you'll receive individualized responses for those.